Hello and thank you to everyone who has signed up for this amazing opportunity to go over the survival for your practice and the COVID-19 challenge with Mr. David Campbell. I'm going to be introducing Dr. Jean Bailey, the president of AACP, and she, from this point, is going to be talking kind of more about who Mr. Campbell is, and we are looking forward to having you all on here. So without further ado, Dr. Bailey.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Good day, everyone, and welcome to our conference, our webcast here. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to present this to you. Today we'll be discussing survival of your practice and your team in this COVID challenge with Mr. David Campbell. So last week, my husband and I, we tuned into a webinar, and it was presented by the AAFE with Dr. Lewis Malcolm, and I decided that was a really good conference webinar that we should possibly use. So I did reach out to Mr. Campbell, and he graciously agreed to share his tidbits and advice to us. And thank you so much for doing that for us. So as I was brainstorming and deciding, well, I wanted to get this to our AACP members, but I also wanted to make this a larger collaborative effort. So we did reach out to several other organizations, and you saw their advertisement on there. And I want to thank them for joining in this collaborative webinar. So we do have ACAM, which is the American College of Advanced Medicine. So this is physicians with us. We do have the AAOP, which is the American Academy of Orofacial Pain. And we do have the American Academy of Physiological Medicine and Dentistry, the AAPMD, along with our AACP members on this call. Now, I did invite several of our West Virginia practitioners as well, so welcome to my home state practitioners. First and foremost, what I'd like to do is I'd like to hope that you, your loved ones, your staff, and your patients are minimally, and that's a really hard word to use at this time now, affected by this pandemic. This pandemic will eventually run its course, and we know that, so we kind of have to prepare. Our individual practice survival is vital as this new normal evolves. So we're in an evolutionary process now. Strategic planning now and action implementation will help ensure practice survival. This is a fluid situation. We change on an hourly basis. No discipline has any answers to what's going on now. But united as colleagues, we can survive this. In the weeks to come, we hope that more collaboration with more organizations will occur, and we can ill afford not to share our knowledge and support with each other. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mr. David Campbell. Mr. David Campbell, he is a partner. Oh, that's great. Yeah. So he is a partner at the Cleveland office of Lewis Brisboe, and he is a member of the Labor and Employment Practice, and he's based in Cleveland, but he also works nationwide. He represents clients in state and federal courts across the United States, including Ohio. Additionally, he represents employers in front of state and federal employment-related agencies. One that's particularly important for us would be OSHA, but he does do EEOC, DOL, NLRB, and OCRC. Lots of acronyms there. So David practiced extensively across many industries, including hospitals, retail, restaurant, and dental organizations, and all sides of the private organizations. So as we're going along, and David, thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us. You will have time to submit your questions. So if you go over, submit your questions at the end. He will be happy to review this with you. So without further ado, David, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bailey. And thank you for the nice introduction. I echo Dr. Bailey's comments on hopefully everybody and your families are doing good during this unique and difficult time period. As Dr. Bailey laid out, I handle labor and employment issues. I handle those issues around the country. And these last, I would say 2 weeks, but maybe I would extend it to 3 weeks, have been a very busy and unique time period. I gave a presentation for the AFE last week with about a half-hour notice in advance. And the only reason why I was able to do it is because I've been dealing with these COVID-19 issues on a regular basis. I've worked with many of the hospitals, smaller practices in the healthcare arena, but I also work with manufacturers and every other type of employer. And so in most cases, you have some differences, but as the COVID-19, as to the employment issues, they are very much the same. So today, we're going to go through some of these issues. And like Dr. Bailey said, if you have questions at the end, feel free to do that. And then as we go through, you will see my email at the end, and I'm happy to respond to you if you have any follow-up questions as to it. And so, Jordan, could you move us to the first slide? So today we're going to discuss, and obviously you're facing individual questions and issues, and so we may discuss some different issues, but the baseline of this presentation is going to go through the newly enacted, at this point it seems like a long time ago, but a newly enacted federal sick leave law, the newly enacted federal FMLA law. Those two provisions were just went through the House and Senate, signed by the president a week ago. They're going to go into effect next week, and we'll go through those points. And they do have application far beyond what the typical FMLA law does and what the typical federal laws do. So you may be surprised as to it, but we are going to go through some exceptions. We're also going to talk about, hopefully, will be passed today and signed, the $2 trillion relief package, go through some of those points that may help you weather this storm and may help you come out of this COVID-19 crisis, hopefully in a position to make a good 2020. Then we're going to go through the final two areas before the questions as to best practices if your practice or business is open in whole or in part during the COVID-19 crisis. And then if you are considering a partial or full shutdown of your practice, where we're going to go from there. So each of those topics I'll address, and then anything that you have as to questions, feel free to let Jordan know, and then we will try to get to as many as we can post. So Jordan, if you can move to the next slide. So let's start with the new federal sick and leave law. There's many different acronyms out there, but the bottom line is that whatever you call these laws, these were just newly enacted. And I think that they were enacted really before the federal government understood the impact of this shutdown and the impact of the COVID-19 crisis was going to have on businesses. They were really enacting a law, and this started before we had the rolling stay-in-place orders and before we had a lot of employers voluntarily shut down. This law was more or less put into place thinking that employers were going to be operating as normal and that we were just going to need to provide employees with some additional pay if they were unable to work. So I don't know if this one, if we were looking at it today, if the House and Senate would have passed it in the same means, and many people say, why do we have this? But I think the reason why we have this is because of the fact that this was done quickly, and it was done before we really knew the impact of that we'd have 3 million individuals on unemployment before the end of March. This law is going to go into effect on April 1, 2020. And so it's coming around. We just had a notice issued by the Department of Labor. If anybody needs that notice, you can either get on the Department of Labor website or feel free to email me. You just need to post that. Some employers that have all their employees out right now may email, but in general, it's a matter of posting. This law, most importantly, it's another very odd issue. We have a federal law that does not apply to our large employers. So if you have 500 or more employees, you're not going to be covered by this. If you are under 500, you will be covered by this. And we'll talk about some of the exceptions. That if you have an entity that might be part of a larger entity, we're not going to go into all that right now, but there is an integrated employer provisions whereby it would be the same as the FMLA. So, for example, if you are associated with a larger hospital and that larger hospital had more than 500 employees, there's an argument that you would be excluded because you may be an integrated employer if your HR went through that larger organization and some other factors. So that's not something that you could look at as another exception to this if you're part of a larger organization. Jordan, if you could move us along. So the first exception before we get into what the law is that is there, and this is still being hashed out. I mean, on the presentation last week, it was primarily to a lot of dental businesses, and our dental friends immediately said, well, this will apply. As of right now, we don't know how broad this exception is. In fact, there are letters from a lot of the dental associations asking for the Department of Labor to exclude employers in the dental and in the healthcare arena from this act. But as to this right now, what we're looking at is that both the FMLA portion of it and the sick pay portion of the act both include a provision where an employer who employs healthcare providers and emergency responders can exclude those employees from purposes of the act. And so the way we've been looking at it right now, I have some smaller hospitals who do not have over 499 employees, and then with those hospitals, we have literally been looking at which employees would fall within emergency responders and healthcare providers, which employees would not. So, for example, our accounting department, we may say they're covered by this. The individuals who are the nurses and the doctors may not be. Now, some of that may say, hey, that's a little harsh, and we'll talk about it. What can we do? We're going to provide the leave anyways. We're going to talk about some of the issues here whereby there are some tax credits. And so, as an employer, if you can exclude, but you're nonetheless going to be providing this type of leave, it may be something whereby you exclude certain portions of the leave law from those employees, include others so you can take advantage of tax credits. So you're going to have to look at that and make a determination as to your business on how to see if it works. If you're a dental organization right now, we just have to see how this is applied as we go. It may be the dentists and the hygienists are not covered by this as of right now. The definition is not there. The only definition in the FMLA is very, very limited, and I'm hopeful that that's not the definition that's applied. So, Jordan, if you can move us to the next slide. The next exception, and unfortunately, a lot of organizations, we just can't take advantage of this for all employees. For those that we can, if there is a work at home option for employees, unless somebody is too sick to work. So if somebody is out on a COVID-19 absence and they're too sick to work, and we'll get into the reasons. If somebody is just simply on quarantine and is able to work, if somebody is handling childcare issues, but they can handle the childcare issues and continue to work, if you can give them work from home, you can avoid making the payments for just sick pay. You can pay it, for work at home. And so that is a large exception that a lot of employers are taking advantage of, and some employers have even said, with this exception, this leave law is not going to negatively impact our business. But that is another exception to look at if you're an employer and you say, hey, this is really going to impact us. And let me just point out, it is going to apply over these weeks from April 1 and during this crisis. If we reopen, and not if, when we reopen, whether it's on Easter or May 1 or whatever date it is, this leave law that we're going to talk about is going to go throughout the course of the year. And so if we continue to have COVID-19 absences, closures, and those types of things, we will still have this leave law until December 31. As of right now. So today you might say, well, I'm closed, and so it's not of an impact. When you open, these same issues may very well be there. So Jordan, if you can move us to the next slide. Here's what I wanted to point out, the tax credits. And obviously you want to work with your accountants if you're going to take advantage of it. But the key point is that there are tax credits for both the FMLA portion of this, and this FMLA, as you're going to see, requires some paid leave. It's not just the unpaid leave that the typical FMLA requires. We're also going to be applying the sick leave tax credits. And so If you are going to give the absences anyways and make them paid, this may actually be a benefit to your organization to look at. And so again, if, for example, you're going to pay employees as we get down to the closure, if you're going to pay employees during the course of a temporary closure, it may be something that you look at as to the tax credits. Could you make your pay somehow be covered by the Sick Leave Act or the FMLA? So you can pay your employees a benefit, but you can also get the tax credits. And so it's just something to look at. And again, each organization is going to have to look at this law and look at it and see, how can I, work within it, and is there any benefits that I can get from it? And so it's a very, tricky situation for everybody, but there are some benefits to this. And so what these tax credits mean is that if you are making payments, there are some, they're capped, but there are some tax credits that employers can take as they're making their FICA payments to the federal government. So something to consider. And most importantly, if you are making payments, keep good records of them, so then you can take advantage of these tax credits through your accountants. Jordan, if you could move us to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, the federal sick leave. We have the two portions, as I said. We have the FMLA portion, and then we have what I call the sick leave portion of it. And I just want to make sure that we're all understanding of the different portions of it. And so for the sick leave portion, it is a law that says any employer from one employee up to 499 employees, all employees are covered, whether you hired them the day before the day before our April 1 effective date, whether you hire them today or whether you hire them on April 2nd. As soon as they're hired, they're going to come under the Federal Sick Leave Act. And so it's important to look at, typically these acts require some type of period or hours worked. This does not. And so during the course of the year, if you have to hire new employees when you come back online, it may be something that when you come back online, you're going to have to, consider this sick leave. As to full-time employees, this is in addition to any leave that you provide now. You're going to have to offer 80 hours of sick pay. So it's essentially 2 weeks of pay for employees. And so full-time employees who are considered the 40 hours a week, they're going to get 80 hours. Any part-time employees are going to be entitled to the number of hours that employee typically works over on an average 2-week period. So it wouldn't be during the shutdown. If you are on a shutdown or a reduced schedule, they'd be looking back, say, in January, February, and see what kind of hours they would have. And so these are in addition to whatever you provide today. And so if you have very rich benefit packages, all of a sudden you're going to add to your rich benefit packages potentially 80 hours of sick pay for each of your employees as to it. So it's just something to consider as you look at your policies moving forward. Jordan, if you could move us to the next slide. So let's talk about the federal sick leave on what is considered a covered absence. So on our federal sick leave, we're going to be looking at it next week. We're going to say, okay, if we're working, whether it's April 1 or we're working, let's say May 1, an employee comes forward and says, I've been quarantined. I was in contact, the health department called me, I was in contact with somebody who's been diagnosed with COVID-19, and I'm supposed to take a set period of time for quarantine. Under this act, you are required as an employer to pay them for the quarantine. So whether or not you would have paid them before, today after April 1, not today after April 1, you would be required to pay them. Now again, unless an exception applies. If I'm quarantined and I can work from home during that quarantine because I'm well enough to do so, you can pay me to work rather than sick leave. But just remember as it comes through, and if we do continue to have more of the cases, you could have more employees who fall into the quarantine. The second coverage is somebody who's been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. So again, if somebody is suffering from symptoms and their doctor says we're going to have you self-quarantine for a 7-day period, they're going to let you know. And again, they're going to be entitled to pay after April 1. Whether or not you would have paid them before, this is going to be a new obligation to provide them pay. But again, if they can work from home, if they're a nurse, you could potentially carve them out. We'll talk a little bit about the nurses and some of that, maybe the best way to handle these as we get into some of the best practices. The third area is if an employee, and this is really the big one where I think as you give notice is, today if somebody just were to say, and I get this from a lot of clients today, I'm scared, I don't want to work. I have a family member living with us. I'm afraid that if I work and I'm subject to it, I'm going to put them at risk. I'm going to self-quarantine. Today, employers can make the decision, do I consider that an absence where I'm going to pay somebody or not? Some of the clients that I work with are not making that a paid leave of absence because they don't want to open the door to everybody missing work. That's your decision. After this, if that employee sees this notice, it's real simple to be covered. All they have to do is say, I'm experiencing symptoms, I'm going to go see a doctor. As we know, it may be very difficult to see a doctor right now as to it, and so somebody could easily be out 2 weeks without ever seeing a doctor. So this is really the one where I look at it with the symptoms, because it could very well just be somebody comes in, they have what otherwise would be considered a cold, they have a fever one day, they feel hot, next thing you know, again, you're paying them. So it's one of those points where you have to look at, and this is going to be the one big one that I would say is the wild card, so to say, as to what's going to be covered. Jordan, if you can move us to the next slide. The final two areas are, the first one is if I'm caring for an individual under the circumstances that we went through, number one. So if a son, daughter, parent, spouse with somebody that I'm caring for and they've been isolated and I have to care for them, then I can be out under this. And so, for example, if it's a child was subjected to somebody who had COVID-19, they have to be in quarantine. A mom could say that I'm going to care for my child and I'm going to stay home as to that. The final provision, and this one is really critical because we may very well have schools out for a while, at least in some locations. I'm hearing, for example, I'm in Ohio. I'm hearing that Ohio is not going to reopen schools. And this final provision, and this is also relevant to the next federal FMLA, is that the employee is caring for a son or daughter and the school has been closed due to COVID-19 precautions. And so again, the good news is that most schools have been closed, and because we have stay-in-place orders in most states, if somebody had a child care issue and you're still working now, presumably that would have already come into place. When this goes into effect on April 1, that person who comes forward and says, hey, I need to care for my 6-year-old who's out of school and I can't do it, again, you can do the telework, you can let them work from home. But if this is somebody who can't work from home, you need them in the office, and they're saying they have to care for a son or daughter whose school is closed, you're going to be paying the 80 hours or their part-time hours for the 2 weeks to provide. That final provision is most relevant because we're going to address the FMLA provision next as to it and to do it. So that one is the 80 hours. If they're part-time hours. We've talked about the exceptions. It's going into effect April 1. Jordan, if you could take us to the next slide where we'll talk about FMLA. So on the FMLA, most small employers, if you're under 50 employees today, unless you're associated with a large organization, you're saying, what is the FMLA? I've heard about it, but I've never had to comply. And I'm such a small employer, giving somebody 12 weeks of leave is just going to be too much for me. Well, the federal government said, and this has gone from a very expansive provision that was initially presented by the House into something that's much narrower. But so that's the good news, but it's still going to potentially cause some great impact for your business. And so number one, it's expanded from any employers from 1 to 499 employees. So if you got 500 or more integrated, you're out. If you're under 500, you're going to be covered, whether you have 2 employees or whether you have 250 employees. Number two, this one does have a little bit of a coverage. So if somebody's hired on April 1, they will not be eligible for this portion of the leave for 30 calendar days. So if you hire somebody April 1, it's going to take 30 calendar days before they're covered. They are eligible immediately for those 80 hours or the part-time hours that we talked about, but this additional 10 weeks of time will not come into place until they've been working for 30 days. Jordan, if you could move us to the next slide. So as we said, as I pointed out in the sick pay, the only portion of the sick pay that's relevant to the FMLA is if you have a son or daughter who's a minor, who's in school, their school has been closed due to the COVID-19 crisis, either on April 1, or if it closes at some point, if they're in summer school and it closes and a parent has to care for them, as to it, you are going to then trigger not only the part-time and or full-time sick pay, but then you're going to trigger the expanded FMLA. The expanded FMLA is not going to cover, I'm in quarantine for COVID-19, I'm feeling the ill effects. Now, remember, and this is one point, if you're over 50 employees and you're now complying with FMLA, obviously, if somebody says, I'm ill, I'm in the hospital, and I'm recovering from COVID-19, they're eligible for the normal FMLA. All of our normal FMLA coverage is there. This is just simply paid leave, and it's only applicable to somebody who's caring for a son or daughter who's a minor as to it. And so this place of care, so daycare as well. So Jordan, if you could take us to the next slide. This leave, unlike the typical FMLA, so if I am off and I'm actually in the hospital for COVID-19 and I'm going to be there for 6 weeks recovering, I'm getting unpaid federal FMLA if my employer has more than 50 employees. This law now says if I'm out, though, for my son or daughter whose school is closed, you're going to pay me during the course of it. It's not just unpaid leave. You're going to pay me. Now, the first 10 days are unpaid, at least under FMLA, because they didn't want to double dip. But remember, the first 10 days, 80 hours, are covered by sick pay. So if you're a covered employer and you have a covered employee who says, I have to care for a son or daughter, school's been closed, I don't have anybody else at the house who can do it. My husband or my wife is working for an essential employer. They're at work. I have a 5-year-old, daycare or school is out. I have to be there. You can't give me telework. I'm not under the healthcare exception. I'm home. I get my first 80 hours of pay. Then I move into FMLA, and that's for the next 10 weeks. If school remains closed and daycare remains closed, I'm going to be out and I'm going to get paid 2/3 of my regular rate of pay, but there is a max that can't exceed $200 per day or $10,000 in the aggregate. So if you have a highly paid salaried employee, there will be a max on how much they will be paid to care for their child. So this is actually going to be a payment for somebody by you to care for the child. So if we could, Jordan, move to the next slide. So we just talked about all those points, and then before we get to some of the questions, I want to talk a little bit about the best practices if operating, best practices if closed. And when we talk about if operating, I think today you have some practices. There are some employers that are still operating. Yeah, you know, if you're in a state with a stay order, are you an essential business? Are you able to comply with the board regulations, emergency care, or whatever it may be? Number two, what we have is the issue of when we reopen, likely we're going to still have some of these COVID-19 remaining issues. We would expect, but we don't know what's going to be here in May, June. And so here's if you're operating. I will say in looking at it, number one, another area, we talked about OSHA, but right now, most of these stay orders are being implemented by state health departments. Governors are having the state health department apply. So all of a sudden, we've gone from just an OSHA and maybe our state OSHA to now it's the state health department. And so, for example, in Ohio and many other states, if you're an essential business or you're permitted to be operating during this time frame, if an employee, and let's just take it to Ohio, and I know that many states are the same. If you're an essential business operating today in Ohio, if one of your employees complains to the health department or notifies the governor that they think that somehow you're not complying with that stay order, whether you're not an essential business, whether you're not following proper COVID-19 procedures that we're going to talk about, you don't have enough soap in your dispenser, The first step is that the police can visit your place of employment. Second step is Department of Health will visit your place of employment. They have every right to come in, I guess, at least they believe they have every right to come into your place of business to audit, to review all of your COVID-19 procedures, to walk the floor, and to, in fact, I've had in Ohio, the Department of Health has stated that if employees are violating the 6-foot rule, even if we post it and we try to encourage employees to do it, if 2 employees were to hug in a break room, that the plant manager would actually get a misdemeanor criminal charge against them. And so I have not seen the actual criminal charges, but the threat has been made at least by the Ohio Department of Health. And so, and I know that Illinois, for example, have police who visit. I know California, I've heard of actual criminal violations. I've heard the LA County shutting off water to businesses that they do not consider to be essential. So this is a new world we're in, and so be prepared. So if you're operating, I've also seen if you're, for example, a dentist, there are lots and lots of dental board complaints that dentists are making, presumably because other dentists are saying if that dentist down the road is open for emergency care and they're caring for my patients, some of those patients may say, hey, they were there for me at a time of need, I'm going to continue to go. And so just telling you my view, why would a dentist say, hey, another dentist down the road is violating the dental board regulations by providing emergency care? I think in general, it's because of the fact that they know that the competition may be that those patients go elsewhere. So be prepared. If you are opened, make sure that you are strictly complying with the stay orders. Make sure that you're strictly complying with the CDC and state health department regulations. All employers, whether or not you're a healthcare organization or not, obviously CDC says if an employee is sick, don't come to work, stay home. Number 2, the EEOC permits, and many state Department of Health are requiring that you either take the temperatures of employees when they come to work, or you provide them with some voluntary stations to do so, and or you talk to them each day about how they're feeling and encourage them to take temperatures at home. Number 3 that the departments are all looking at is the 6-foot rule. It's not mandatory. It's not as if we have to have a hula hoop around us. If work requires 2 people to get within 6 feet, that's permitted. But I've had Department of Health in many states require mask and other PPE if 2 employees are going to be within 6 feet of each other. As to that. Finally, the final 2 points are accommodations that state health departments are saying even before the sick leave law, that if an employee is raising issues, I have diabetes, I don't feel comfortable working, that the employers need to respond to those issues, grant some type of leave, unpaid or paid to that employee, or again, risk violating the health orders and potentially have criminal violations for those. So if you're operating, be prepared. The final piece is if you have an employee who's COVID-19 positive, how do you respond? Number 1, the CDC has guidelines out on how you clean the workplace in that situation. There are specific guidelines. I urge you to get on CDC to do that. 2, if you had an employee, and sometimes small employers, it's hard to keep confidentiality, but when you notify other employees, step 1 is clean. Step 2 is you want to talk to that employee who's been diagnosed to get all of the employees and customers and patients that they've been within 6 feet of. Over those 2 weeks, you're going to want to notify all of them. You're not going to say who, but you're going to let them know that they have been in contact or may have been in contact with somebody who's been diagnosed with COVID-19. If they're an employee, you're going to have to give them a leave of absence. I believe it's 14 days, but you're going to have to look at your state and to verify that you can comply. And you're going to have to give them the paid under the sick leave. And so again, the 6-foot rule is important if you can keep employees outside, because if you're operating a business and somebody has been diagnosed positive, and I've heard the Department of Health say it, if it's a second shift and everybody's working closely on a second shift and you have a COVID-19 positive employee, the Department of Health is going to say everybody on that second shift is going to be given a two-week paid leave of absence because they all may have been subjected to it. So that's what you're going to need to look at. Jordan, if you can move us to the next slide. And we got 2 slides, and then we'll get into some questions that you may have. If you're closed or closing, number one, and we'll get into the $2 trillion package. But number one, what you got to think about is, am I paying them or not? If I'm paying them, I will tell you, I'm going to look to see if I can get under the Sick Leave Act, because I'm going to want to get the tax credits. If I am going to pay people, if you're either saying I'm going to let you use sick leave, vacation, or I'm going to pay you, you got to think about that. 2, as a piece of that, you've got to look at the issue of unemployment. If the sick leave, if the $2 trillion package is approved today, unemployment benefits are going to meet or exceed most hourly employees. And so if you're an employer, the one benefit from this is if you furlough, if you ask employees, I'm going to put you on leave right now, go apply for unemployment. Their unemployment benefits in most situations may meet or exceed what you're paying. They're at least whole, as to it. So we'll talk about that. So you're going to have to think, am I paying or not? Do I need work during the course of it? Obviously, if you're a business owner, you can visit your practice and you can do it even if you have a stay order. You can go in, as long as you're not open for business, you can go in and do what you need to do in order to be prepared to reopen or to handle those issues that we know are going to occur over a 2-week period that you got to respond to. If you need employees to work, or you're doing a skeleton crew or less, you can consider, if you're just not as busy, you're doing only emergency, you can certainly consider, do I reduce salaries? Do I reduce hourly rates of pay? Maybe the alternative, I pay them more if they're coming in and dealing with individuals and maybe putting at risk. Do I pay them more? So those are the things that you got to look to make your decisions. The unemployment as a backstop is there. The final piece I'll put in there is many employers are looking to what's called a furlough. And the furlough is that they are going to give unemployment benefits to pay the salaries. They're going to then check with their health insurance provider, their broker, and they provide the health insurance over the course of the temporary leave of absence. So the cost out of your pocket is health insurance. Unemployment picks up the wages, and then that is what's called a furlough. And when you reopen, everybody comes on back into the practice. Obviously, some could leave, but when you open, they're still technically employees and come back. So Jordan, if you can move us to our final substantive slide, our relief package. There are lots of relief packages out there. As I said, the unemployment benefits are increased. Some cases, those unemployment benefits, when we look at the state and federal, if this is passed, it'll be higher than what they're earning. If you're a small business owner, if you're an independent contractor, if you have independent contractors, they may be eligible for the unemployment benefits, or you may be. So I would apply. The other point that a lot I know that smaller employers are looking to is this, and it's something that you really need to look at to see if it's passed and make some decisions on how you do it. We just talked all about furloughs, unemployment, and everything else. There's one more piece that may be helpful, and you got to look at it as a business. When do I think I'm going to open? Am I staying open? And what I do. So one piece that we don't know exactly how it's going to work, but there are loans if you have under 500 employees. They're going to be refundable loans. And my understanding it's going to be a 4% interest rate. That 4% will be out of your pocket. So whatever loan you get, the 4% will be out of your pocket. The principal is going to be based upon your employee work hours from January 1 to the end of February 2020. So if you had 5 employees and they were all working full time, I don't know the exact amount that you'll be eligible on the loan, but it's going to be based upon those work hours over those 2 months. The loan that you would get in principle would have to be applied to keeping employees paid. So if you moved everybody to furlough, you can move them back and say, good news, I'm now going to pay you, and start out, for example, on a paid leave of absence. I believe there's also some additional monies in that loan where you can pay some of your expenses, your mortgage, etc. The benefit to it is that you can take this loan through June 20th. And so if we can get open, or you already are open and you're earning some revenue, if you're paying your employees through a loan that's refundable, then maybe you can, even if you're slower, you can earn some profits here and you can help your 2020 bottom line. And so it's something to look at. You're going to have to strictly comply. You're going to have to look to see if it makes sense for you, but it's something that is supposed to be done quickly. It's through the Small Business Administration. I would certainly look to it so you can make your decisions whether you're staying open, partially or fully, or whether you're closing. So I would definitely look at that. And so this moved to the last slide, Jordan, then I'll take questions. Just to highlight what I do, and my email address is here, my phone number at the office. I get to people fairly quickly. Now is a busy time. I'm on lots of phone calls and whatnot. If I don't get to you, I typically will get to you right away. So if you have a follow-up to this, I'd be happy to do it. We're going to answer some questions now that anybody has, and we'll do it. But like I said, I wanted to make sure you had this. We're a nationwide law firm. I can answer most questions in all states. If you needed an attorney in some other state, we have that. We do everything from medical malpractice, dental malpractice, to employment, to corporate, and everything else. So just wanted to put that out there. And Jordan, if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them.
Yes. So first of all, thank you for going through that presentation. It's a lot of very useful information to small business owners, people running their own practice. So the first question we have is going to be, is full-time considered a 40-hour work week? I have multiple employees who work 32 hours per week, but have been considered full-time. Our office is open for patient care 40 hours a week, but if we want to pay something for the week of March 16th to 31st, when we were shut down, should we pay it as bonus, sick time, regular time, etc.?
Okay, so Jordan, just so I understand it, so the practice is open. It was closed for 1 week, and they want to go back and pay. Is that the question?
Yes, they were shut down for that week, and should they pay it as bonus time, sick time, or regular time? That's correct.
Okay. Well, number one, the employees may be eligible. You have to look at your state. They may be eligible to simply apply for unemployment benefits for that 1 week that you were closed. I know that you want to be the good employer and to pay it out of your pockets, but if they can get paid for that 1 week through the unemployment, it's something to consider. So I would look at your state. Number two, if you're going to pay it, the only issue would be if they're exempt. If you're going to pay for any of the time, you typically have to pay for the week. But in this case, I would say if you're just going above and beyond your policies, any of the above is fine. The only thing that I would look to is if you do have some sick leave or something like that, you may want to consider, hey, I'll let you utilize some of that for that week so you can get paid. Only reason why I say that is that if you're going to continue running, you're adding sick pay to it through the federal leave, you may all of a sudden have some additional time. So I would say you have lots of flexibility there because you're going above and beyond the course of the law and likely your policy.
All right. Next question being, does shelter at home recommendations from the state of California count for Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act?
Well, that's a very good, and I'm going to assume that the employer has been shut down because they don't qualify as being an essential business, and they're shut down. The answer to that question will be decided, hopefully not in the courts. Hopefully we'll have a very clear discussion from the Department of Labor so we don't get into the courts. Our initial reaction, and this is interpretational law, and this is consistent with, I've been talking with many other law firms about it. If you are closed down, then nobody is eligible for sick leave or FMLA. So you have to be missing work. And so if for example, I were to shut down a portion of a business, those employees who were in that business, there's no work available for them. So sick time would not be available. Now, with that said, and you got to look at it and you got to make decisions. If you were going to close down and pay them on April 1, if I'm going to pay them, I may pay them under the federal sick leave and consider trying to get the tax credit for it. Again, this law, there's some benefits, there's some costs. You're going to need to look at it as an employer and make your decisions as you do that. I urge you to check with your lawyers and your accountants to see what makes sense. But if you're going to be paying somebody during this time, I'm going to be looking to see if I can get those tax credits or something like that. I know this is a rough time for all employers, whether you're operating or not, and we're all looking to make sure we come out of this as strong as possible. We want to be kind and gentle to the employees, but we also got to remember we got to have a business at the end. And so you got to look at these things and say, how can I preserve my assets in order to make sure everybody has a job, hopefully when we reopen May 1. So that's my answer to that. Jordan, if you have anything else.
Yeah, just two or three quick more questions. One is does putting employees on furlough or firing temporarily temporary employees get you out of the new sick leave law prior to April 1st, 2020?
As I said in the last answer, most certainly if they're laid off before April 1, I think that there's no question at all, because there's no work available to them, and so therefore they would not be missing work whether or not they had childcare issues or were quarantined or anything else after, especially if they moved to unemployment immediately. Number two, I don't see any difference between today or April 2nd. Again, if we're going to lay everybody off, there's no work available, and so unless we were going to try to pay employees and take advantage of the Sick Leave Act, I don't see any legal obligation to do that. We are getting more guidance from the Department of Labor. That may change, but the reading of the act is that I have to actually be missing work in order to be eligible for the pay.
Will EFMLA be extended to working grandparents needing to care for minors at home, or is it only for working parents? I think this is in reference to like if the grandparent is the one raising the child, or
I don't have. I think we'd have to look at the law to verify. My initial reaction is that anybody who's there to care for a child, I would say that would be covered. Again, if you're going to give the leave regardless, to say you are going to give that leave, I mean, you could certainly look at it and say, hey, under today's unemployment laws, they can temporarily go on unemployment. If you're going to pay them anyways, I would get under the Paid Sick Leave Act so I can get the tax credits as to it. So it's a matter of each employer should be looking at these things, and you really need to be looking at your situation. This is not a one size fits all, because some businesses are operating full bore, some are slowing down, some are totally shut down. So you just got to look at what makes sense for you as an employer and what monies you're paying out to your employees.
And last question for you, Mr. Campbell, is my employee is working from home but needs to work at reduced hours to take care of kids. What is she eligible for?
Well, the first issue would be, whether she fits into any of the exemptions for healthcare provider emergency. If not, and we fall within 1 to 499 employees, today what she'd be eligible for today before April 1, she could apply for unemployment, and if she has any hours reduced due to COVID-19, in my view, she would be entitled to unemployment, so she could do that today. So she was typically working 40 hours. She's now only going to work 15 hours a week. Unemployment should supplement that. On April 1, then all of a sudden we're in a different world on April 1. April 1 would say that employee would be entitled to be paid for those hours that he or she is not able to work because they're caring for the child. And so all of a sudden, if they're supposed to work 8 hours a day and they're working 5, they're going to get paid for the 3 and not work. And then arguably that's going to continue for 12 weeks or until the school reopens. And so what you could consider is that, can I have somebody work from home? And if they can't work, say, for example, because a husband or wife is going to work at a different job, could I let them work 8 hours throughout the course of the day? Do I really need to have them work 9 to 5? Could I say that, look, you can work from us from 9 to 12. You say from 12 to 3, you have childcare issues. We'll let you make up those hours at night. I don't see any reason why you could not. Now, again, you could just simply say, I'm going to pay the 8, and then I'm going to account for some of those under sick pay. I'm going to get the tax credit. So you got to look at it from an employer. These are very specific, unique situations. So when you hear an answer to one, you've got to look at it in the issue spot and say, is it going to apply to me? And if so, how? And right now, there's benefits and there's costs, and you got to look at that as an employer, and you got to say, do I take the loan? Do I take the sick leave? And so these are unique time periods, not only because we're dealing with COVID-19, but because we do have different buckets of cost benefits, and we need to, as each employer, I think more than ever, look at it from, I know you're dealing with either you're more busy than ever, or you're worried about, are you going to stay open? You got to look at and say, let's take hold of these employee issues and really look at it so you can come out of this as strong as ever once you reopen.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Campbell, for being an excellent resource in this time. We hope that all attendees that were able to view this and take some notes for their practice as well as for their small business are able to not only benefit from your expertise, but also be able to reach out to you in the near future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Like I said, my email address is there. If you have any follow-up, I'd be happy to get to you. But I urge you to look at these from a situation if you're really it's going to take some thought with all the different costs and benefits. Really plan this out. Get an advisor to help you to plan this out, both from the tax situation as well from the employment situation. You got lots of decisions to make, and these next 2 weeks are going to be very important to how your 2020 ends up. So thank you very much for taking the time. I hope it was helpful.
Yes, it was. Thanks, Campbell. And
Thank you.
for all of our attendees, we just want to once again thank AACP, AAPMD, ACAM, and AAOP for coming and attending this meeting. And please be sure to check your email for additional webinars, which our next one is going to be at April 2nd, so Thursday, April 2nd at 4 p.m. And we're going to go ahead and shoot an email out to all of our members. And in order to continue this conversation, if you have any comments or any other questions, you can feel free to go to our Coronavirus Resource Center at aacfp.org. And once again, thanks for attending, and we look forward to hearing from you in the near future.